Today, we shall be exploring the most iconic piece of headwear of the Middle Ages, the not-a-hennin. So join me today for an absolutely not comprehensive dive through this hat that has fascinated and generated scorn for centuries. In our last action-packed episode, we delved into the who, what, where, when, why, and how of this headdress, which went by a variety of names in the 15th century, none of which seem to have been hennin. See episode 1 for more details. Today, we're going to explore the construction, materials, and layering of this jaunty fashion statement, my lessons learned from years of sporting it in a variety of live fire conditions, and my plans for not-a-hennin 3.0. Let the geeking out commence. So let's talk about the construction of my hennin and why I construct it the way I do. So when I started this whole living history journey in the mists of time, I've said it before, I'll say it again, the internet was a vast wasteland of chat rooms and porn and not much useful. And I didn't have access to a research library. I didn't have easy access to a university library, and I had no idea about interlibrary loan that I possibly could have maybe done through my high school and probably could have done it through my public library, but it didn't occur to me that that was a thing. And even still, so much has been published since then on the topic of medieval fashion and Renaissance fashion. So much new evidence has come to light that, 30 years ago, there just wasn't that much out there like there is now. That means I had to come to a lot of conclusions on my own. Fast forward to the early aughts, I was living in Germany, my little happy German idyll, and I went to the Berliner Kunstgewerbemuseum, which is the Berlin Museum for the Applied Arts, which has a vast trove of gorgeous medieval treasures. Please don't let this hideous, hideous facade fool you. Inside is a wealth of daily objects from medieval life, very well preserved, beautiful pieces of furniture like this one, but also this bishop's mitre was on display there when I was there. And I'm not certain whether it's still there or not. It might be back in Minden in the cathedral treasury, but this mitre was amazing. And it dates to the 1420s and 1430s, Central Europe, and I saw it and I noticed this little corner, the top corner had worn away, the fabric had worn away, and there I saw wire frame for the top to maintain that nice peak, but also parchment, vellum, and in the description it in fact said that it was composed of vellum and silk and embroidery and all sorts of metal applique, and I had a eureka moment. I said, oh my God, that's gotta be how hennins were also made. If these tall bishop's mitres, which were sort of the sacred version of the atour, then why would you construct the secular version any differently? And it made sense because vellum is light, it's easy to work with, it's easy to sew through, but it's also very resilient. It's easy to shape into the shape you want. It's easy to cut, super light. I said, that's it. My next hennin, as I called it, my next ouateur is going to be framed in vellum. Well, that meant I had to find real vellum, and back then it wasn't so easy. And so I ended up with pergmentata, which is sort of a, it's a paper vegetable version of vellum. And so that was my frame. And I had, ran it around wire edging, and then we had to think about the decoration. And again, I looked to the bishop's mitre. Well, the bishop's mitre is covered in this ornately embroidered and appliqued cover on the outside that you see, but on the inside, it's actually just plain silk. And then that is all basically sandwiching this wire and vellum frame. Well, too easy. So next question is, well, how should I shape it? Well, first off, let me say, I don't think I have the kind of face that does well with my hair scraped back and just my face showing. It's just, I don't like that look on me. But thankfully, there are plenty of images from the 1470s, depicting ladies with this beautiful, frame on their face, these beautiful frontlets. And I said, well, I can do that. And that made me look more closely at the hat upon their pates. And that's when I saw that there seemed to be two parts. And it made sense to me because one part actually had a different angle than the other part. You had the cone part that was protruding out, and that was of a much more narrow angle. And then you had the part that actually framed their head, and that actually widened out to frame their head in a way that would allow it to sit, I thought, more comfortably. And hence, this was born, my two-part atour. We have the front part which has a wider angle to fit my head, and then the narrower cone part in the back. Okay, fair enough, 2 parts. And then I noticed that a great many of these in the cone part was embroidered. And sometimes later on I noticed elaborately. For example, we have Maria Baroncelli, Maria Portinari, as she was known after being married. Her atour is just, it's pearled. Look at all these gorgeous pearls with her initials and her husband's initials. That's the M and the T, Maria and Tommaso, right? So I said, well, I would like to do that too. And I was working with the materials that I had at the time. This is actually wool, and I embroidered in white silk this cross pattern. You can see it in this checky form, and that checky form, you know, you see on Maria's hennin. You also see this kind of neat diagonal checky form on Mary of Burgundy's, Marie de Bourgogne's hennin in this beautiful frontispiece from her Book of Hours. I was a baby embroiderer back then. I'm much more skilled now. So this is just white silk chain stitch in that pattern going all the way around. And as you can see in the back, I didn't even think about trying to make it match up. Right, so I embroidered this on black wool because, you know, so many of these atours on actual real people, they're black on their base. The exception of Marie de Bourgogne, hers is this beautiful rust color. But for the most part, when it comes to real people in portraits, in actual proper portraits, and not something that could even be vaguely allegorical or fantastical or fictional, they nearly all seem to be this black or ornamented black. And that makes sense because in this era, black was the up and coming color, because to achieve black, a really good, proper, deep black, it was a very expensive dyeing process, which of course was another form of conspicuous consumption. And of course, also the Duke of Burgundy in this era, Charles the Bold, black was his go-to color. And so he, of course, set a lot of the fashion trends. So no doubt the move towards black headwear was sort of a way of imitating the Duke and being one with the court. That was basically the most powerful court in all of Europe in this era. Here we are, back to this. And so for years, decades, almost, I went with this sort of 2-part fashion, and then to create that nice little frame in the front, I have the lapette, the frontlet, as it's actually referred to, which they're actually mentioned in inventories from England in this era, from the 1470s and 1480s. They actually mention these frontlets. And so I thought, okay, well, that makes sense. It must be a separate piece. Well, how to attach that separate piece? Does the separate piece attach to the atour itself? Or I tried that for a while, and then I actually attached it to that band. And I tried that for a while, and I could never quite find a satisfactory angle, really truly satisfactory angle for this, in my opinion anyway. So went with that for a while. That's all fine and well. But I then started, as I always do, I never assume that what I know is what I know, because in the last 10 years, even the last 15 years, so much artwork has been digitized at high resolution. And I've been able to visit so many more museums in person in Europe and collections, Robert Baron collections in the US, and get really so up close and personal with these paintings that guards get nervous. And I've been able to see details that I didn't notice the first time I started really looking and considering this. And what I noticed is what I thought was a 2-part atour wasn't 2-part the way I thought it was. This black part, this wider part, I noticed is actually part of a hood construction. It's almost like someone took a hood, the kind of hood that had the liripipe, and they cut the liripipe part off, opening up the back, and then they slid that over the horn, the corne, the atour. And that would explain why you see these veils that just seem to disappear into the atour. Like, how does that happen if it's one piece? It's because it's not one piece, because that veil is actually draped on this, and then the hood is put over top of that and the veil pulled out so that it hangs nicely. And then I had another epiphany just a couple of days ago. I was looking through imagery of the earliest French translation of Boccaccio's Decameron, Decamerone. And it dates to the 1480s. And I noticed some of the ladies, there are these gorgeous, almost full-page illuminations depicting the companions telling stories. And I noticed in two of them, this interesting, clear, like translucent silk coif that they're wearing, and it's open in the back. And their hair is pulled through it, and it's folded back. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. It's like those winged coifs that I make out of linen that some of you have called my signature hat. Huh, that's really interesting. That would be a very noble form for the winged coif, to have it made out of such a diaphanous and expensive, finely woven silk. But it's a depiction of the Decameron. So I always take that sort of thing with a grain of salt, because those are fictional characters, and there's obviously sartorial choices in these pieces that indicate that this is basically a fantasy story. These aren't real people living now. These are people from the past. Everyone was aware that the Decamerone was an old story, an old book by then. Okay, nice, but filed it away. But that same day, I started poking around at Hans Memling's portraits, real portraits of real ladies from this era. And suddenly there they were. This plethora of these super transparent winged silk coifs, some of which were just exactly like the ones, or possibly like the ones in the pictures from the Decameron, where it's just the front part that goes around the head and folds back. But then others, I noticed there was a veil component attached to it. As you can see in these pictures of these ladies, they're wearing it over top of their truncated atours, of their little flower pot hats. And you can see very clearly that it's very obviously attached directly to the coif, and that they've just decided to wear just that over top of their truncated hat, their truncated atours, to then frame their face in this delightful fashion. And then I thought about all of these portraits I'd seen of ladies in these hauts atours, and there was this veil framing their face under the black hooded part. And light went on. Like, of course, that's it. They put on the black band, then this silk coif hooded veil thing goes on, and they turn the brim forward, and then they put the atours on, and then they put the hood over top, and then they have that nice, very fetching, light, transparent silk frame around their face, and then the heavier hood, which could keep the sun out and or keep them warm. And it all just made sense. It just made sense. So my next project is going to be that. I'm going to be making, I have the perfect silk for this winged, this transparent winged coif veil thing. Now I've got to go and see if I can identify it in the inventories based on the language. That could be tricky, because the inventories and the laundry bills and account purchase receipts and that sort of thing aren't necessarily that specific when it comes to items ordered. They're probably just listed as coifs, or maybe even just as veils, rather than any specific thing. But I'm going to see if I can find them anyway. That failing, no matter what, I'm going to be making one of these. I'm going to make the style that has the veil attached to it. It's a little bit stream of conscious video. I hope you guys are enjoying this freeform, watching me ramble at the camera. Anyway, I'm going to be going back to this black part, which, as I said, I'm pretty certain in most cases is part of a hood. And sometimes that hood continues all the way through the back, like it's complete drapes all the way back, and then there's a little round part, I think, sewn on, and then the atours is inserted in there. And then there's some where it's almost like a cap with sort of the back open on the cap, and it's just got built in that those wings that come down the sides, because you can see, for example, in this portrait, how there is sort of, you can see through to the veil that's hanging down the back of her head, the back of her neck. Right? So then you have just the lappets there instead of the whole hood covering her back. So I'm going to be making some version of this hood and trying just the atour part and seeing how that can be made to sit more comfortably on my head, more stably on my head, and how having the hood might actually help it stay more securely. Okay, so let's talk about my lessons learned from this version of the atour. First off, I covered it in wool. I really suspect that the level of society that this headpiece represents, it would not have been wool unless it was a resplendent doeskin wool. If you don't know what doeskin wool is, look it up. The stuff is like satin. It's so shiny and silky and smooth. Just absolutely gorgeous and super expensive and super hard to find for less than $70 a yard. Maybe they might have covered this kind of hat in that kind of splendid wool, then embroidered and bedecked. But I think it's more likely silk velvet, possibly, much like this here. And especially because the extant miters, which, like I said, they represent the sacred version of this secular hat as far as I'm concerned. All these miters, they're lined in silk or linen, and they're covered in absolutely splendidly adorned silk with actual gold and metal thread and ornaments and bezants, as it were. So I'm going to be making it, the next one is going to be made out of black silk velvet for certain, which I have. This one is lined in black linen because I was actually applying a medieval method in that I was using scraps that I had. Did they have black linen? I don't have evidence of black linen. I have evidence of yellow linen in Ireland for saffron. I have evidence of blue linen and green fustian. But I suspect if it were lined in linen, it would probably be lined in white linen. But the bishop's miters, all of the bishop's miters that I have personally seen, they're lined in silk. So I think it should probably be lined in silk as well, not in linen. And that would just be nice against your head in any case, although it might create problems with not adhering like Velcro to my band. So I'll be changing the materials. Black velvet, black silk velvet, which I will be embroidering, and then silk lined on the inside. So I made the mistake of not putting the wire framing around the edge. And as you can see in this picture, this wire is very substantial. It's not a thin wire, it's a pretty heavy gauge wire. And especially for a comtesse who travels as much as I do, where porters are literally just throwing my luggage around as though it were nothing worth anything. That means that I actually need all the protection for the edges that I can get. And camera on the inside here, you can see how all the rigors of travel have just crushed this in on itself, basically. After I discovered the bishop's miter, I then stumbled across another discovery. Specifically, these remarkable pieces of vellum, which once formed the foundation of an Icelandic bishop's miter, dated to circa 1500. But it's not just any piece of vellum. In the 16th century, they had upcycled a 13th century Old Norse translation of 12th century French romances by Marie de France. Look at this picture with the light behind it. You can actually see the holes where they not only attached the lining around the edges, but also in the middle where they attached the applique roses straight through, not only to the ground fabric, but all the way through to the parchment. Because of course, look at those roses. They're immensely heavy. Those are applique, three-dimensional embroidery, actual gold thread in there, and I think there's padding. So they're pretty heavy. So if you just attached it to the fabric, it would pull the fabric down, but they actually tacked it straight into the parchment. You can see that in these amazing little holes. That also gives me some ideas for the construction. So on my upcoming newly redesigned, newly recreated hennin, I'm going to do this pearl work. And I think that means to keep the fabric in place and to keep maybe the weight from pulling it down, I might end up actually doing tacking stitches at regular intervals to keep the heavier embroidered and embellished fabric from pulling down and shifting from the position it should be. Well, thank you for listening to my stream of consciousness about the haut atour. So, do you have such a headdress in your wardrobe? Have you made one? How did you make it? What materials did you use? What is your experience with it? So going forward, I'm going to be making a new one of these. Stay tuned for the project video on that. Otherwise, let me know about your experiences in the comments below, and stay tuned for your moment of Kitty Zen.